Okay, so for this next stretch of the afternoon, we want to have a panel that has on your program, you might have seen this, a very big title. It's sort of open to almost anything. It says panel discussion on politics, educating the public, and the environmental issues. And the panel that we have here is a quite diverse one. And so I wanted to basically, jumpstart it with a couple of questions. But I have a feeling that it's going to very quickly, evolve back into the discussion we've had all along this afternoon. So, and because, we have 6 folks here on the panel, I would say for each one, when you reply to something, maybe, not 15 minutes, but more like the sort of the crisper versions, just to, so give a chance to everyone on the panel. The question that I wanted to start us off with is maybe a way for you to introduce yourselves in what you bring, because not everyone has had a chance to do that, and that is to talk about your personal connection to nature and how that has contributed to your choice to work in the kind of work that you do. Why did you end up working in politics, in philosophy, in government, in the kind of way you do? What has your experience of nature, or your connection to nature, had to do with that, if anything? So anyone who wants to jump in and just take it.
I guess I'll start.
Okay.
Get things going. Those who don't know, I calculate the risk from hazardous waste sites. So I do a lot of EPA work. I've actually worked with Holland and Hart on the military superfund site.
You might have.
Okay, and so my perspective is one of use of science to work with the public to explain the risks associated with hazardous waste and problems with the environment, and working with the responsible parties, the people who are required to clean up the environmental contamination, and the regulators whose job it is to oversee and facilitate the process. So I have, similar to Hal, seen a lot of environmental degradation over the years from hazardous waste sites, which was very different from the sort of idealized country setting that I grew up in a village of 120 people in rural England. Very different. And I think I came into the field with this sense of, here's the environment, it's something that I have a heartfelt connection to, and found myself working at these hazardous waste sites trying to facilitate an outcome which resulted in cleanup, and kind of fell into some of the politics associated with the solution is not necessarily perfect. It is a solution, but it still leaves things behind that probably shouldn't be there. So that's my connection to nature. That's the field that I've worked in, and it's always created something of a split or a dilemma, looking at the problem that exists versus the way that politics and the regulations deal with how to resolve the problem.
How does your Jungian piece fit in there?
Well, you have to deal with the split somehow, right? Well, I think looking at that problem symbolically has really forced me into asking the question psychologically. So why is it that we externalize into the environment? Why is it that we can do that? Why is it that we come up with pragmatic solutions that that work to some degree? And that's a question that I want to get to later, is there seems to be a disconnect between the science and the emotion and the politics. And how do we resolve that problem? Because I don't think I've resolved it internally necessarily. I think it's a larger problem. I think we're all faced with that. And the political situation you described earlier today, I think, is the same problem. So I'll keep quiet.
I'll go. I give a little bit of a background of how I initially maybe first was connected to nature. In my childhood, I spent a lot of time in nature. I had some influential role models that taught me a lot about environmental degradation and biodiversity and a lot of very important topics. And going to UC Berkeley, I think, kind of opened up my worldview a little bit. And when I graduated, I wanted to work on. I saw a huge insurmountable challenge that we all faced with global climate change and energy issues, and I thought fuel cells were maybe the breakthrough technology that might provide a major solution for our energy needs and our environmental challenges that we face. So I started there, and having worked on that technology that's sort of a breakthrough technology, one thing that's been missing is seeing a direct impact from the work that I've done. So it's always been sort of theoretical and out there, and we've got this motorcycle, but people ask if anyone bought them, well, no, they're still in this embryonic stage. So I think that's that desire to see some change and some sort of kind of like what you mentioned in giving back to nature, giving back to that connection. That piece has been kind of missing from my career. So I've sought it out in other ways, in going on adventures and exploring and expeditions and climbing and things, but spend most of my time in my career, and that part has been missing. So that's why I'm moving more towards something that I think is more near term with biofuels, and something that I hopefully can see in my own backyard, where I breathe the air in the Los Angeles ports, which are laden with particulate matter and contributing to lots of lung disease and all kinds of problems. And hopefully that will satisfy that piece that's been missing. So.
Well, I guess I'll go next. What's my connection to nature? I've been struggling with that for days, because I don't have a seminal event in my life that I could say was a defining moment that somehow brought to the surface my connection with nature. I guess if I go back far enough, why I got into science and sort of thinking about my connection to, what I call nature, basically our support network, with the framework in which we live. And I hearkened back to the films of Jacques Cousteau, and sort of drew me right in. And from there, I was a lost cause. I mean, not sort of necessarily go into oceanography, but something having to do with the natural world. And so that was my introduction. Subsequent to that, I think my scientific inquiries were part and parcel of that, a follow-up to that as well. In other words, I began to ask questions about how the world works, why it works the way it does, how we're influenced by it, how we influence it, so on and so forth. And when I finally arrived in the world of politics, 12, 14 years ago now in Washington, D.C., I came out of an academic institution. I was doing work on climate change, basically paleoclimate. Had largely dropped out of the academic scene in terms of chasing grants. I decided I didn't want to chase grants anymore. I wanted to think about how the world worked, and I decided that no one was going to pay me to think, but I decided to do it anyway. And so my parting shot was a summary paper trying to bring together everything I could. I thought about the climate system and how it worked from the beginning to where it is now, how the pieces fit together. When I arrived in Washington, my world changed. I was introduced to a politician at the time in the Senate. I was asked if I'd stay on and help with the issue of climate change. I said yes, only for a short time. 14 years later, I'm still there. And the short time is still, I keep saying I'm going to move west one of these days, but I got drawn in, I think. But I think my sense in having gone into the political world was that I think the things on my mind and things that have been on my mind since I got there was that things don't happen by themselves. You have to make them happen. And I decided I'd play a hand in trying to make things happen. Not directly, but indirectly through a member or political institutions, as Steve was talking about. Secondly, the notion of justice. I mean, everybody having an involvement in the process, decision-making, discussing issues, and so on and so forth. that notion stuck with me a very long time, and continues to sort of stick with me in the sense of justice very broadly. And so the notion of justice and environment, our place in it, that we weren't separate from it, are all parts of, I think, what drives me. I mean, intellectual realization is part of it. I'm part of what we describe as nature. I mean, it's inseparable. But I think oftentimes that is largely intellectual. It's hard to sort of, I think there are moments when you viscerally sort of feel that. And mostly for me, it's been intellectual, with sort of moments where I more viscerally, I think, feel that connection. But I think that's that's the best I can do, coming close to answering that question.
Could you just add one sentence what you actually do in Washington, just so people know a little bit more about that?
I try to wrestle with this idea of improving the communication of science, largely through the media, because the media influences all of us in one way or another. And they get to most of us. And so through the media is a big way into everybody's desktop and parlor and whatever. And I also try to inform decision makers as to what's happening with respect to science by running a series of briefings on Capitol Hill on a monthly basis. And the philosophy behind that is I bring in the people who actually did the work, as opposed to the people who want to spin the work. And so it makes a difference for a lot of people when you bring genuine voices in. And I think the richness of it is not necessarily the topics themselves, but rather people connect to people. And so when you bring a flesh and blood somebody in with a name that's just been a namesake in the paper, it makes a world of difference for people. And they realize, wow, that's a real person. Now we know what that person looks like. And so they make this really fundamental connection. And so the rest of it, I think, is gravy, but still, these are the people that are doing the work as opposed to everybody trying to spin what that person said. So we're trying to build a certain capital, intellectual capital. Anyway, that's what I do.
Thanks.
I'm happy to, I'll keep it brief and hopefully not make it too personal, but I grew up in Boulder and spent a lot of time outdoors, obviously. I think tied into the climate change, I've spent a lot of time in Alaska too and love just the country and the mountains and the wildlife up there. And so the Arctic Wildlife Refuge has become, of course, an issue that we've debated a lot recently. And I think one of the proudest moments of my brief career out there was at the end of the year last year when there was an effort to attach, like, once again, the drilling proposal to the budget reconciliation, or the defense spending bill, which of course was sort of a must vote for a lot of members. And my boss held firm, and we defeated that by about 2 votes. But that for me was personally very gratifying. I think just the connection that I've had with nature has been spiritual in many ways, just being outdoors, appreciating the majesty, the grandeur, the unique places that we all love to enjoy, and to protect something like that was very important to me.
Like Steve, I'm in the midst of a bunch of philosophers and psychologists. I'm a lawyer too, probably the only other one here. But I'm going to go back to a wife who's a clinical therapist and a son who's studying to become one, so I'm kind of in the thick of it, whether I want to be or not. But, I sort of thinking of the question that many of us are being asked about our connection with nature. I realized that I had kind of a Norman Rockwellian childhood. Where I lived, I had access to the woods in a 5-minute walk, and I just spent all of my time in the woods with my buddies, and we did a lot of playing of touch football and softball and all that kind of stuff. But over time, I always found, it becomes a cliche really quickly, but I found it to be healing and just kind of centering to be outdoors and mostly in the woods. So I was fortunate to have friends who shared that with me, even in the suburbs of New York City in a bedroom community. You're in the woods, and we spend a lot of time on our bikes just walking back to find ponds and do a lot of fishing on our own. That kind of evolved into getting into skiing when I was a little bit older, and then big time into hiking, which I still do. I just finished a 3-week hike in South Island of New Zealand and loved every minute of it. So that's really part of me. But I think I also knew that based on the role model that my grandfather played, as well as my father, sort of just taking us for walks and pointing things out to me, that it really became part of me and still is today. Where did I go from there? From junior high on, I knew I wanted to do something around the environment, and I was kind of by the time I graduated, I was a person of the 60s and an activist and all that kind of thing, and I knew that where I was headed was to become an environmental lawyer, and so I just spent my career doing environmental law at the state and regional and international level, and really enjoyed it for the most part as a regulator and an enforcer and statute writer and bill regulation writer for state agencies, and energy work during the oil embargo a few years back, heavily involved in that. And I did a whole variety of different kinds of environmental work and found that I was able to move around and just sort of build up a knowledge base, which I found very satisfying, having a kind of a free rein. And learned a little bit about politics and the legislative process and how that worked. But I guess I really think of myself as a government bureaucrat in a way, but someone who has a responsibility to work to protect the environment, to do what statutes tell me, but also to be creative in ways that I go about doing that. So I got involved in climate work pretty big time right after the Clean Air Act was passed and right after Rio. And ended up, I think by virtue of the variety of environmental work that I had been doing, selected to work on a U.S. Multi-agency program internationally working with developing countries. So I was in Nepal and Mongolia and Kazakhstan and worked on emission inventories and vulnerabilities and action plans, basically, and building capacity in the developing world. Came back to the U.S. At EPA. I'm in the regional office of EPA in Boston, and our turf is basically New England. And became very engaged in working with our states, which is what our responsibility is supporting them, getting funding to them, backstopping them, pushing on them, leaning on them, cajoling them, and found myself getting funding for states to do greenhouse gas inventories and then action plans, and come to find out it was possible to get funding for communities. So I work with cities and towns. New England now has the largest cluster of cities and towns that are doing climate action work. I'm kind of a sole practitioner. I don't get funded out of any particular pot. I work in an air division at EPA. But it's through networking that I feel like I'm able to leverage some power and sort of keep on a broad front moving forward on the climate issue, which turns out for me, after the many years I've been doing this kind of work, is the most important to me personally, but also the most interesting from a policy walk standpoint, because it's so complex and the implications are so vast, and yet they're also so minute, and you really have to capture people's attention to the issue because it's so difficult from a science point of view. And I'm not a scientist, I'm a literature major, so I kind of live and breathe literature too. But so I do work with communities. I've formed a network of colleges and universities across the Northeast now that does sustainability work, and I'm really eager to push them in the direction of greenhouse gas emission targeting and commitments. And also with educators, I do a lot of outreach and education around climate science and impacts, and letting people know that there is activity on the government level, albeit much of it now is at the state and local level. It's pretty exciting work to be doing. I'm working now on a regional climate action plan with Eastern Canada. We have regular meetings with them. We've developed programs and initiatives to sort of advance the ball, kind of on our own with the states, all voluntary. And we get good support now from our regional administrator. Get some support from Washington. Sometimes there's funding that's available, and my job is to get the money to who I consider my constituents. And I think I've been pretty successful at that. But one of the reasons I came here was to learn from other people how to integrate better what is already inside me, and I think from what I hear is inside lots of other people around this circle, in ways to communicate better, because it's such a hard issue. It's hard for politicians to actually want to grapple with. There are interest groups out there that are really resistant. There are people who feel it so strongly in their heart that they are just bursting to have something happen. And so I find it really gratifying to be doing something that I believe in myself, and that I feel that through my sort of background and career work, maybe I can be instrumental in sort of just kind of moving things ahead a little bit more. But I feel nature that that's part of me. It's part of everybody. And I've been lucky because I've been able to turn that love into a career and found real satisfaction in that too. I'll stop there.
I don't really want to say much more about my connection to nature for two reasons. One, sort of put the few lines I can make sense of myself in my bio, and then secondly, if Hal's reading of Ed Wilson is right, then I've never had a connection to nature. So, I've had a connection to nature, money revenues. But I do. Let me say something about my connection to politics, because I think that's shaped, in a strong sense, the way I do environmental philosophy. And between college and graduate school, I was actually a junior Senate staffer for Sam Nunn, who was then the senior senator from Georgia. And it was one of the best years of my life, actually. I found it extremely exciting, even though sometimes frustrating, although the Dems were in the majority then, so maybe a little bit more fun. And I mean, I was never disillusioned by my work in Washington at all, and I've always kept in touch with my friends there. But for reasons that still kind of baffle me, I decided to go to grad school in philosophy. And I kept my hand in politics by forming a political action committee with three other people who are now either college professors or high school teachers, called Clean Up Congress. And we ran this for 5 years. Essentially what we did is there were no PERG organizations, sort of PERG model, right, of politics, where you get some college students to spend their summer going door to door, lobbying on a particular issue, and also raising their own salary. So it's a very low cost kind of way of doing politics. We formed a PERG style organization that would take the top 10, or the bottom 10 in the League of Conservation Voters assessment, of environmental report card, like the worst environmental guys, and we try to target which races were the most vulnerable, and then we would go in and hire a bunch of college students to do this kind of stuff. And so that was how I spent most of my summers in grad school. And I think as a result of that strong interest, and then the work I was doing in environmental philosophy, the work kind of came together, and the school of thought that I helped to develop in environmental philosophy is called environmental pragmatism. So you actually don't have to make a choice between environmentalism and pragmatism. You actually make them work together. And the thrust, though, is basically just this, which is how can you make environmental ethics and any kind of value studies about the environment more relevant to environmental advocates or environmental policymakers. And so that's really been the focus of my work. And the best sort of the point at which I was really able to bring this together career-wise, because we know the academy is not always receptive to crossing disciplinary boundaries, was I was lucky enough to get a job in New York at NYU as director of a very tiny environmental studies program. So I did for the last 6 years. And all the students in my program were on that career trajectory, right? I wasn't training little philosophers anymore. I was training people who were going to go to work for agencies and go to work for nonprofits. And people have said this, and it's a thing we all say. Sometimes it's often overlooked, but I know that I learned more in those 6 years from them than they did from me, because I was trying to sort of figure out what is the way that I can sort of teach these people so that they can do their work in the best way, and it was really a way of sort of bouncing off of them ideas about things. And since then, I serve as an advisor to mostly for the National Park Service and NOAA, and the EPA quite recently, and the National Science Foundation, working on science policy issues and how do we sort of get more people in the humanities and social sciences invested and working with these agencies to improve environmental management, which I think is sort of one of the most useful things we can do at the moment, given the current structure of power in Washington, is to keep the people in the agencies, keep their heads up, basically, at a time when they're under a lot of stress.
Can I just have one thing?
Yeah.
I felt like I didn't really honor your question, because for me, Carl Jung runs through a lot of what we're doing here. And the psychology, Jung was very interested in the environment and spent a lot of time in the environment. And he proposed a theory of archetypes. And I feel like global warming is a problem that affects everyone on the globe, whether they realize it or not. And I feel like that theory can add a lot to answering a lot of the psychological, philosophical, and other questions that are being raised here. And that's where I think that particular psychology fits well with this kind of overarching large problem. So that's why I think it's really relevant today.
So are you talking about the archetype of global warming, or when you say what would the archetype behind global warming be, and what might its shadow be?
Yeah, you could look at that as you could look at it as an archetypal problem. You could talk about what that is and how it manifests, but I think if you just think about it as a very large problem that affects everyone, and everyone is somehow connected to it, then I think the problem becomes more approachable from a psychological perspective.
Just if I could jump in on this, I mean, if you wanted to extend the archetypal argument, you start with the images, and you get very phenomenological with the images. So Mother Earth is heating up, and it raises the question, why? Why is Mother Earth heating up?
I didn't want to get sidetracked into psychology, but I thought I should honor the question at least.
Okay. Well, the way in which maybe this is a segue is that here we've been discussing or talking about nature as well. We're all part of it. Is the life world. It's we're all this one big organism, right? We have this conception of it's the very basis. It's the very fabric, breathing, whatever of what we do. And what I kept hearing in when you talked earlier, and it sort of cropped up a couple times on this panel in just the introductory round too, is that the environment in Washington or maybe in some state houses becomes an interest. It goes from it's everything, it's the very basis of our life, and then it just ends up to being one more interest group like gay marriage or, the estate tax. There's something really wrong with that, and maybe some of the struggle of why it's so hard to bring what we're discussing to the houses of politics or make that connection is maybe because of that strange way of compartmentalizing the environment. I wonder if maybe, any one of you has some idea of why has the environment become an interest, just another interest? Is that even something you would agree with? And how can we move it outside of that narrow box to become really, again, the substance of our very life and throw it open?
I'll try to respond. From my perspective, I think I certainly don't mean to suggest that the environment is merely an interest from a sort of spiritual or philosophical point of view. But as a perspective, as one perspective on a particular question that may be under debate in Congress, the environment is represented by one or more interest groups, and there are many. Whether it's a wildlife organization or a public lands organization or a PERG type organization that is advocating for an outcome or a result or a particular decision. And so it becomes, in the political world, it's merely one constituency. I mean, again, to the extent you accept the premise, which is that the environment is being represented by a particular group of people, and there are a lot of good reasons not to accept that premise. But that's what I meant. In the world that I live in, my typical day is I spend an awful lot of time doing one of about 3 or 4 different things, either writing and working on passing legislation, preparing my boss for hearings or meetings with constituents, meetings myself with constituent groups, or sort of strategically navigating, the broader political questions that we deal with every day. And I spend an inordinate amount of time meeting with interest groups, not necessarily constituents from Colorado, but national wildlife groups or national environmental groups that want to educate me on a particular issue, have a particular ask, and come in for that purpose and only that purpose. So they kind of get compartmentalized, I think, that way. Not for any good in terms of the broader philosophical question.
I think that's a good word. Compartmentalization actually is a psychological defense.
Guys, a follow-up? Because it sounds like the catch-22 looming here. On one hand, I think in Congress, the broad issues have to be distilled by groups of people who can come and ask specific things. I mean, nobody just wakes up in the morning and says, time to do something good for the ecosystem. And so on the one hand, I think any broad issue is represented operationally in Congress through specific requests. But on the other hand, the mere act of doing that reduces the broad issue to a whole series of very discrete asks, which is a real interesting term to use. And how does one get out of that kind of a catch-22? Are there other domains outside of the environment, for example, that have successfully mastered the art of distilling themselves in ways that are politically effective without being reduced to fragmented requests? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I think, yeah, I do, and I think there are a variety of interests, for lack of a better term, that are more broadly and cohesively represented, and therefore don't get as fragmented. I mean, agricultural interests or energy interests, where there are a number of advocates for a particular point of view that align, whose points of view align, and so even though they're acting independently, they act in concert. I want to give you an example. Well,
can you give an example?
Well, let me give you a contrary example first. I don't know if you followed the debate on the Outer Continental Shelf drilling bill.
Yeah.
That was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating to me, politically. There you had, stop me if I'm going too long, but we passed an energy bill last year that was a comprehensive energy bill. It didn't do a lot of things. There were a lot of things left out of that energy bill, climate change being one of them, renewable energy being one of them. But one thing...
What was the comprehensive?
The producers, industry would argue that there wasn't a lot on the supply side in that bill either. And there had been an attempt to include an Outer Continental Shelf drilling component to that bill that was excluded at the end of the day. So here we are a year later, this OCS bill, OCS is just the shorthand for Outer Continental Shelf, comes back in a very different package. We passed a pretty narrow bill out of committee that my boss supported, but with a proposed amendment. It was a diminutive Bingham bill, so it was a bipartisan bill between the chair and the ranking member of the committee, fairly broadly supported, had a good chance of passing in that form. This year, with post Katrina and high gas prices and the political pressure to do more on energy, the OCS bill was the only vehicle likely to move. It was the only thing that everybody agreed probably had 60 votes and could move. Well, lo and behold, Mary Landrieu, who is fighting for her political life, needs to deliver money to Louisiana. She recrafts the bill with Domenici's help, excluding Bingaman. So works on a purely partisan bill that delivered 37.5% of the royalty revenues to 4 Gulf states: Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi. My boss had an amendment to that bill that took 12.5% of those revenues to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which benefits all 50 states. But what's fascinating to me about that bill are two things. The environmental groups were dead set against it, urged the Democrats to vote no. But Harry Reid, who as the minority leader, has as his principal job protecting the Democratic members in Congress, and therefore Mary Landrieu, supported it. And as soon as Harry Reid and Bill Nelson, who was concerned about the buffer off of the coast of Florida, supported the bill, it passed by 74, 72 votes. So there was a sudden shift from a typical sort of substantive debate on the merits where the environmental interests were all advocating against the bill. They're concerned about oil and gas leaks, they're concerned about damage to ecosystems, they're concerned about the deep sonar exploration activities that occur in the Gulf or will occur in order to build the infrastructure to drill this oil. We're all dead set against us. LCV, of course, the League of Conservation Voters, will score my boss and other members who supported it negatively for their vote on that bill. But that became irrelevant as soon as Harry Reid decided that it was important to Mary Landrieu to pass this bill. Just fascinating exercise. And the story's not over. The Democratic support for that bill was conditioned on an agreement from the House not to amend the bill when it goes to the House, an agreement that nobody in the House realistically thinks will be kept. So it's fascinating.
I mean, I just want to give another take on this. Completely compatible with how environmentalism became a special interest. I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow because I'm going to focus on the Schellenberger and Nordhaus essay. And he wants to be brief, so especially apologize for Carolyn for butchering, 200 years of American environmental history. But I think it's but generally speaking, right, sort of think that there are 3 waves that we can identify, and a 4th one that seems to be emerging now, which we don't know what it is. And the first wave is the Roosevelt, Muir, Pinchot conservation wave. And there, my take on this is environmentalism pre-scarcity, right? Before we really understand what scarcity really means, and I think it changes towards the end. And environmentalism is a kind of a special interest there. It's a philanthropic interest, so it's not a special interest in the way we think of special interest in this sort of bad way now. It's sort of things that you're interested in from people who have privileged positions to be interested in, like people who are interested in developing the arts or whatever. And then we get the great sort of wave that starts with Rachel Carson conventionally and goes to about 1980, heyday of American environmental legislation, 26 pieces of legislation, the most important ones, clean air, clean water, endangered species, ends with Superfund. And most of these, if you look at the votes on that, they're overwhelming. The creation of the EPA, I can't remember, there might have been 2 dissenting votes or something like this. And Nixon creates the EPA, models it on the state of Washington's Department of Ecology, which was also started by a Republican government. Now, people can give a cynical reading on why Nixon did this, and then also why he created NOAA. But I will appeal to authority baldly now and say that, Bill Cronin has told me that he thinks that, in fact, I can't remember whether it was Haldeman or Ehrlichman had been an environmental lawyer or a land rights lawyer who was really pushing for this from the inside. There was a less cynical take on the creation of the EPA by the Nixon administration. It wasn't just politics. And then I think about the first image in the media that comes to mind when I thought about environmentalism. And if anyone can find a picture of this, I'd love to have it. Is remember when Reagan was elected, makes James Watt Secretary of the Interior, and there's this picture on the front cover of Newsweek with Watt holding up like an elk head that he just shot, right? And like, this is the new face of environmental concern, right? And this is sort of, this is what it is. And you read something like Mark Dowie's book, Losing Ground, and there's this complete retreat from a lot of the legislation issues, and we get beltway environmentalism, which becomes the real focus on lobbying on the least offensive, big fluffy critters kind of charismatic megafauna issues, which we think we can get a consensus on. And I think there was a sort of identity, not a prurient one in the first wave. The second wave, it was much more, there was less of environmentalism as a special interest, at least if you look at the votes. Third wave, I think we retreat into that, and we're pushed that way, right, by the Reagan administration and the people that followed. And now we're sort of waiting for something else to emerge. So I think in partly it's been our fault, and partly it's been that we've been backed into this corner. And if we wanted to play ball in Washington from 1980 on, except for, including the Clinton-Gore years, you had to conform to a certain kind of model that made us a special interest. And the whole point of the Schellenberger and Nordhaus article, The Death of Environmentalism, this is one that was circulated before, is to try to come up with a model that breaks that, right? Like, if you think about ag issues, I'm sure that on an agricultural bill, you don't just hear from one lobby group, right? You hear from multiple constituencies. So the question is, how do you get multiple constituencies to sign on to global warming as a works projects initiative rather than just simply an environmental issue?
I just wanted to add to that, Andrew. I've always felt that as part of the sort of abuse of language, that part of the political forces in operation tried to undermine the environmental community by initially labeling it as just another special interest group. Whereas Ralph Nader used to come out screaming and says, no way, you're asking me to believe that an environmental organization is the equivalent of, say, Western Fuels, and say that's a level playing field? I said, no way. But effectively, it began to sort of get people doubting the sort of the motivation, or questioning the motivation behind environmental groups. And some people perhaps start thinking, well, yeah, aren't they just the same? They're on after money, power, whatever. I've even heard it said from fairly well-known journalists who will go so far as to question, well, aren't you a special interest as a scientist because you're taking grant money from the National Science Foundation? Isn't that the same as taking money from, again, Western Fuels? And these people want to say, well, isn't it the same? These are really seasoned journalists. These are not people starting out with 3 years experience.
I was on a panel discussion in Houston, of all places, where I was accused of that.
Yeah.
Oh, you take money from the National Science Foundation, you're just a special interest.
Yeah. I mean, and I think what you ran into was the strategic part of it. In other words, it began to permeate into a general conversation. And people started saying it without thinking about it. And I think that's the power of distorting language. And in other words, I guess it leads to the question, do we get the information that we need to make decisions? Or is it so fatally flawed by public relations, by appearances that this works for you, this is in your behalf. And then you come to find out the drivers behind it are anything but in your corner. But it's so elaborately put together and put out there that it takes a long time to figure it out. And those that are intellectually tuned in, sooner or later, figure it out. And a lot of people, it never does become a reality. And so there's all this distortion of language that's hanging out there. And not just sort of serendipitously, strategically, I would argue. And it just begins to get picked up without thinking about it, and it gets amplified and projected out. I think in the long run it undermines the political process or any sort of decision-making process. In other words, if we load people up, if their values are in fact, if we do have a sense of shared values, but we load people up with confused information, how do we ever come together?
Let's just briefly, Tony, one thing just want to say very briefly. I think you're completely right, but I don't think that I'm alone in this circle who have been in working with environmental advocacy groups who have taken a either first or against kind of view of the world, right?
Oh,
Now, I'm not saying
agree,
it wasn't rational, wasn't justified, especially when you're being beat down. That's kind of what the view you take. But also, I mean, added to that is sort of, some of us are closer to nature and some of us aren't. And it's sort of like it's a genetic difference between me and, the guy in the corporate front office. And that just has not served us well.
And I agree. Completely.
I think one of the fundamental reasons that we wanted people to come together is that we don't believe that the person in the front office necessarily has that disconnect that you're suggesting they have.
I don't think they do. I don't think they do.
I think it actually raises a very interesting question, maybe that we can have another round on, which is if environmentalism, at least currently, is sort of the represented by special interests in the halls of Congress or in state houses, then maybe in order to address something as big as climate change that is so fundamental to life in general, we somehow need to get to a place where everyone, and I put that in quotes because I'm not sure that we need everyone, but we need a lot more people to feel that they are constituents, that they ought to, that they have an interest in the climate the way it is, and bring those voices to Washington. Then the question becomes, if they're all misinformed or confused about it, then how do we ever get there? So the question I guess I want to put out to you is, what kind of form of public engagement do we need, public education do we need to help a wider set of people become constituents that could be heard where you work?
Just one tiny thing playing off of what the conversation that was just happening, but when there's this approach of you're either with us or against us, that seems for any environmental initiative to really foil what it is that you're advocating for, because I'm not going to use the term environment because I'm one of those who really doesn't like the term, but the ecological world, it's very obviously not made of blacks and whites. It is a radically pluralistic field of nodes of interdependence, and it's a web work. So it just seems that, and it seems that the Democratic Party, Mitch was saying this in conversation earlier, is by its very nature always much more fragmented, diverse. It's harder for those of us in the Democratic end of things to speak in terms of blacks and whites, good versus evil. And it's just, that's not the kind of worldview so, and yet ecology does seem to fit rather well as an interdependent lattice work of, radical pluralism of beings, all participant within and co-constitutive of this atmosphere, this climate, this biosphere. I wish there was some way that could translate politically.
I guess the panel is expanding, I have a feeling, so let's just open that up.
I thought that was part of the
that's
idea.
fine. It's totally fine. It's totally fine. I think we're moving into the circle discussion here.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate what's been said and the work that's been done, and I thank you, Steve, for coming and so on. And I just wanted to back us up or into another framework to get at this in sort of a fresh way, and that framework is well, there's a couple issues we haven't talked about, but then I'll just touch on the framework. I mean, we really haven't talked about ecology versus economy issues, or the huge lobbies of business and transnationals and so on that prevent legislation often from going forward. So that's one obstructionist area. But the other, I think, is it's kind of, again, what I think this group has potential to think about, and it's suggesting that we as Americans are so isolated in our thinking, even from the global community on these issues. I mean, we're talking about EPA and when it was formed. EPA was formed in part because the Stockholm Conference said all around the world we had to have EPAs, and that was part of the motivation. And even so, linking up our own history to these things is, I think, exceedingly important. But the framework I want to bring back into the discussion is this horribly contested word of sustainability. And I'm only inviting it into the discussion, not to get sidetracked about its misuse and sustainable development and so on, but the contrast that I see in the European community, and I'm not holding them up as ideal, but the European community has entered in a rich and vibrant way, politically and economically, into the discussions on sustainability. So the whole framework is different in how they're talking about these issues. And so you've got environmental ministers who are really entering into both global and national issues. In Germany, you have, what Wolfgang Sachs and others did to say, we've got to have an energy policy, and how Germany moved forward just on that issue alone is a phenomenal example, absolutely stunning example. In 2004, in Barcelona, there was a whole summer of festivals on sustainability. It was Barcelona 2004. It was one of the most astounding examples of sustainable products, sustainable grassroots movements, music, festivals, all summer long. Launched by Gorbachev, but all kinds of politicians came in, etc. When I saw that, I said, I don't even think we could have such a festival in the US, because even these ideas of what sustainability are so contested, and we're not part of this larger conversation. In November, in Holland, at the Earth Charter +5 meeting, the Prime Minister of Holland gets up with the Queen of Holland there too, who's been absolutely supporting Earth Charter and Earth Ethics move. The Dutch government has been completely behind this larger sense. The Prime Minister gets up and says, a sustainable future is not just an optimistic, hopeful view. This is realism, and we in the West, or we in the developed world, have got to have a sense of responsibility. I mean, this is political leadership that is not even on the screen. And I'm saying this obviously in an impassioned way for a couple of reasons. One is that the political cloud under which we operate, I think, sometimes so undermines our energy and our vision. And I think the European community is really taking leadership of immense importance that we need to link up to, and we need to join with the sense that the sustainability framework, whether UN endorsed in all these conferences or grassroots NGO, this is a live and a vibrant community that we are not fully in touch with, and therefore our isolation is even more noticeable in international conferences of all kinds. I mean, is sustainability even a word used in Washington, D.C.?
Well, it's right up there with tree hugging and environmentalism.
Exactly. Yeah.
If I can sort of come back to your question and tie the two ideas together, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but we don't see that kind of political leadership in Washington. I think we do see some of that kind of political leadership in the states. You've got a Schwarzenegger in California who is, taking on the administration with respect to emissions from automobiles, EPA's authority to regulate carbon under the Clean Air Act.
The U.S. Conference of Mayors Kyoto initiative is astounding.
It is
started by the Seattle mayor. There's
right.
150 cities,
or more than that.
243.
Right, so it's almost half the population now represented in that.
So I think you see that kind of leadership from the ground up, or in local communities with local political leaders and others, and that's very important. I think that has to continue. As I said before, the Senate is not going to show that kind of leadership, with the possible exception of a very small sort of baby step that'll be symbolic, maybe next year on climate change. But the real change and the real innovation in technology and new policies has to start in the states and in the local communities, I think.
But isn't that a paradox that the statement was just made, it's the constituents that need to voice their interests and concerns. Clearly the states and urban areas are listening and doing something. So there's some sort of a disconnect here between what's going on at the federal level and the state and local levels that are listening to their constituents.
But maybe that's appropriate, given the issue.
Environmental history, or the history of environmental policymaking in the United States is that most often actually, policy initiatives came from the local and state areas, and then function as laboratories of democracy. And actually, when there was enough trying around those, moved up into federal government and were adopted. Actually, most of the laws that we heard about came actually out of state initiatives. So it's a very common phenomenon. There's nothing unusual actually right now in terms of how Washington reacts or doesn't react to the activism at the local level.
It's federalism. It's
Yeah.
really federalism.
And likewise, it's even a conscious strategy now to do that. I mean, we talked to a number of the people who are writing laws in New England and so on, and they're using it as a conscious strategy to actually create a patchwork of different laws. Because what happens when multinational or even just national corporations have to deal with different regulations, different laws in different markets, drives me crazy. And it costs a lot of money. And so then you suddenly get the business community going to the political leaders and saying, we need you to step up and come up with a standard for the whole country. And so the same thing could actually be said even at the global scale. There are lots of, I'm part of the Global Roundtable on Climate Change at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. It's 150 of the world's largest corporations. They're all sitting there, Toyota, Rolls-Royce, DuPont, and there's no question about climate change. They're saying, how can we get this going? Because, again, we're multinationals, and we've got different rules in Europe and now even China than we have in the United States. And it doesn't work for us. So I think there's real power in that grassroots approach.
I agree. Another example of that is the state, the renewable energy standards. Colorado has Amendment 37 that passed a couple years ago that requires 10% by 2015.
RPS.
The RPS. There are 37, I think, different state statutes, including one in D.C. Ironically, the utilities have said that's just fine. We don't need uniformity for the time being. But I think at the end of the day, you're exactly right. I think as the momentum builds, as the political pressure, particularly in the South and the Southeast, builds to start generating more electricity from renewable sources, they will be asking for a national uniform standard for exactly that reason.
Yes, Kelly. I just wanted to ask Andrew if there's a fourth phase, a new environmentalism or some new word emerging, or we're waiting for it, or to follow the death of environmentalism. What does it look like, or what? Do you see anything happening?
I do. Actually, I'm quite optimistic on most days about these sorts of things for all the reasons that people have said. And what we're going to call it, what it'll look like, this whole idea that Schellenberger and Nordhaus say, like, give up environmentalism, it's like as if that is possible. It's like sort of just, one day there's no more environmentalism. This seems kind of strange to me. But, there's other kinds of terms that people are starting to use in the agencies. I find a lot more people talking about adaptive management now than ever have before. A lot of people are talking about the human dimensions of environmental change. The last contract I had with NOAA was to write a bunch of requests for proposals. They're in charge of cleaning up oil spills, right? And they would go in, and their statutes sort of say, look, you go in and you just take care of restoring the ecology to what it was before. And all these communities that live there say, but there's a lot more to it than that. There was the relationship that our community had with this ecology, which we're losing as well. And so NOAA, for the first time ever, is now interested in the human dimensions of oil spill restoration. And they're now going to start paying a lot of people, hopefully people under this big tent here, to sort of work on those kinds of issues. And I just see more funding available for those kinds of issues than I ever saw before. And what I see on the ground, and this is something I think Schellenberger and Nordhaus overlook, is that the people on the ground, and it sort of goes back to something David said, I see much less of the you're either for us or against us kind of view. And I think it's because we went through that and it didn't work. And my first tenure-track job was in Missoula, Montana, University of Montana, and I was there for 2 years. And a lot of my friends there were arrested and sent to federal pen in Boise, Idaho, because they were flocking trucks and stuff. And I came back for the first time this past summer to teach a course at University of Montana. And those same folks are now doing outreach with the forestry companies, and they're getting roads taken out of the Lolo National Forest in cooperation with the Forest Service and all kinds of stuff. And they just kind of go, yeah, well, we beat our head against a wall, it didn't work, and this sort of cooperative model seems to get results. So the problem, though, is it's the scalar issue that sort of Baird captured quite nicely in his talk, which is the on-the-ground stuff seems to me to be vibrant and amazing right now. And I think it is helping with the climate change issue, but I think that really getting traction on the climate change issue, I have to agree, does not come without national leadership. Because it's that kind of national leadership which is really going to give us the sort of the ability to interact with the kinds of other states that we were talking about before. So that is a critical point. And hopefully it'll be some kind of labor environmental, and not labor in the traditional labor sense, but sort of, what we really need is for someone to sort of figure out is that a lot of money is going to be made. Not only a lot of money is going to be made by these companies, if there's sort of more uniformity on these issues, and also the technology is going to be created to clean up these problems, but you can put a lot of people to work. You put a lot of people to work, and we know that. It was true with the CCC, and there are tons of jobs to be created out of addressing these issues.
Can I push this point a little further, and it sort of builds on what you just said? There's some empirical evidence that actually shows that popular engagement with the environment seems to go in a opposite direction every time there is a leader that is perceived as environmental in Washington, and then people sort of drop off with their own environmental, enthusiasm. So in some ways, you could almost say that we don't want a leader in Washington because we want to keep people engaged in the sort of grassroots, on-the-ground activism that we see right now. And there's a lot of arguments to be made, I guess, that you could say, well, we might not see a leader that is as brave as the Europeans might be. So I guess the question I want to put out is climate change an opportunity for civic renewal in this country? And I mean that in a much broader sense. In terms of democratic engagement and re-engagement in the democratic process, is it maybe an opportunity that we're not grasping and that we're not really building? And should we?
My view is, unfortunately, this doesn't occur in a vacuum. Presidents don't run as environmental presidents or not environmental presidents, whatever the opposite would be. The problem now, there were polls that CBS did just before September 11th that came out, and you had a growing majority, front page of the New York Times, right? CBS New York Times poll, growing majority of Americans concerned about climate change. They want the Bush administration to do something about it. Then you get September 11th, and this disappears. And then you get, I guess, was it Don Nichols from Oklahoma, standing in the well of the Senate saying, now we know we got to drill in Anwar, damn it, because if we don't, the terrorists win. And what we've created now is a nation of people who are afraid. I was watching CNN last night, and it's just all over the media since this thing in London happened, right, with the liquid bombs. They identified like 18 hotspots around the country and had a reporter at each place. Sort of the next terror threat, Los Angeles ports, South Louisiana. The only place I didn't have a reporter was in my bedroom closet, saying, the terrorists could get in here easily. It was just. So this is what's the forces that we're sort of working against. So if it was without that background, I would say might be something to that. But on the other side, I think that what I see on the ground is that people are getting engaged in local environmental issues. They don't think of themselves as environmentalists. They think of it as something like getting involved in the PTA. They think it's a form of civic engagement. And I'll talk about one of the biggest projects that I think is happening with that tomorrow.
So a question for any of the panelists. It has to do with global warming as a fundamentally a problem of the commons. And most of our political institutions, from local politics, state, and national politics, are designed to deal with things within our jurisdictions. And there isn't any clear jurisdiction for the commons. There's some spotty record of international environmental laws that work or don't work. But because it's a problem with the commons, do you think that our current institutions are up to the task, or we need something else because of this issue? In other words, California is already wrestling with the fact that its air quality can be affected by Asia. And yet they have no jurisdiction.
I think, others know more about this than I do, but I think, this president committed the United States to the first Rio proposal and agreement to look at something like Kyoto. I think the failure to ratify Kyoto was just that. I don't think it's for lack of institution, it's for lack of political will. I think we have the legal mechanisms, we have the institutions in place to participate globally on an issue like that.
But what's changed? Going back to my first question to you, if we had, a change in government, what's changed such that Kyoto would pass now?
Well, you mean assuming a different
assuming a different
administration. I think, as you've heard, businesses in this country recognize the importance of addressing, global warming and a carbon strategy. I'll link the two together for their survival over the next 20, 30 years. And it's that consensus in the business community that drives change.
I haven't heard ExxonMobil admit that global warming is human-induced.
ExxonMobil is a notable exception.
That's what I thought, Susie, your question about the relationship between civic renewal and climate change is a really, really important question. And it represents a real space for action. There are so many aspects to this, public health, for example, school lunch programs, that you can tie in to this effort. Whether or not you like sustainability as a word, sustainability has in fact become the rubric that brings together issues as varied as organic agriculture, school lunch programs, local health initiatives, more employment opportunities, as you suggest, Andrew, working with different labor groups that feel disenfranchised by what's happening. I think there are a lot of communities and a lot of examples of communities around the country where this is beginning to happen. They need to be highlighted as models for success. It's not unlike, it's not completely unlike, the big bad so-called Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe, which seemed so monolithic and impenetrable, that ultimately got undone, at least in Czechoslovakia, by civic organizations that were sort of under the radar in a sense, but the body of which really represented a kind of a popular sovereignty in relationship to civic renewal. And I think we need models like that that require organization and good hard work and the building of the constituencies below the radar. I am not suggesting that we don't need great national leadership or a bully pulpit. That stuff's really important, of course. But if it's absent, then we have no choice in a sense than to mobilize in the way I think that your question suggested. And I'd love to hear other examples. I guess I'll turn this into a question now of exactly this type of civic renewal, because we're not only dealing with the challenge of climate change, but we're really dealing with the challenge of democracy now. And they do need to be linked. So thank you for that great question.
Well, we have examples. We mentioned the mayors and their united voice. There's an initiative begun by the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers. A letter was sent out to all of the college presidents in New England and the chancellors, asking them to support a regional action plan, which had already included very aggressive reduction targets. There are 245 college presidents in New England, believe it or not. That's our industry. And 100 have said, yes, we're going to do that. And it's not in a rigid way that we're going to set our own targets necessarily. It might be curriculum development. It might be research projects related to climate change and responses to it. So I think it is starting. It's starting to become part of the parlance, part of the civic responsibility. Even in just those two sectors, there's engagement with hospitals. The energy issue is all pervasive, and the cost of fuel, the energy future is what's in our face. And I think business knows that at the most basic level. I mean, we're all kind of searching, well, what do we do and where do we put our eggs in? We have multiple baskets we clearly have to have out there. But I guess I'm feeling at this very moment, at least optimistic that, as you are, that we do have the mechanisms, we do have agencies that have the capability. And I think it is a matter of will and leadership.
There's one thing that's sort of been said and then forgotten and then said again. And I'm a great optimist of what's happening around the United States on state level, local level. We've been there, we've seen these wonderful programs. But until we recognize that this is such a dysfunctional leader, this is a leader that has become an enemy of science and has created this dialogue or this adversary position between religion and science. And we're dealing with a very, very dysfunctional, ignorant, dangerous person who's put all his eggs in terrorism because he's incapable of thinking beyond that. I'm sort of soft-soaping. I'm just saying. So I think that if there is a regime change, hopefully there'll be a regime change, then I think whoever is the next president, God, it could be a Rockefeller Republican, just give us somebody who is more than a C+ student, who knows a little bit about science. Marilyn and I have had the great fortune of meeting with presidential science advisors before this administration. These are wonderful people on both sides of the aisle, but they believed in science. So I'm not discouraged because everybody here is working so hard, and communities are working hard. Kids are coming out of school understanding a lot of stuff, but we really in a strange time right now, and I don't think there's any way around it unless you have regime change.
To use his word.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, I do. I use that on purpose.
I'm a bit reluctant to raise this issue because I don't want it, first of all, to fall flat on the ground, and secondly, not to disrupt this conversation because I have to confess that what I have been listening to has made me less pessimistic than I usually am. And that's good. It's all to the good. I mean, I didn't know a lot of these things. Like, I'm blown away by this idea about you get patchwork of things going, and you force the major companies to say, well, this is costing us money. You better get the feds on board with this. I think that's. I want to stand up and cheer whoever came up with that idea. That's great. So I want to first confess that this has really been good for me to listen to this. I'm thinking about tomorrow when I have to sum this up. And I just go, well, this is great and hopeful. I got to put some shadow shit in this. But now I'm speaking as a Jungian therapist. Here's my question. And this is not meant to negate what we have heard, but what I have found has been left out is the human psyche as part of nature. And our conversation is as if reason alone would be enough. And yet reason that has forgotten its roots in the unconscious, the way Jung has taught us to think of the unconscious, is precisely what has gotten us into this mess. So how do we bring and make a place in politics and in policy for the fact that as human beings we are more than reasonable people, that our human psyche is part of nature with all of its darkness, all of its shadow, all of its feelings, all of its complexes. I just want to throw that out there. And if that question doesn't make sense, then let me personalize it by going to the committee. All of you spoke so eloquently about how your profession was seated and rooted in your vocation to nature in your early years. As if there was some draw, some magic, some spell of the centuries, to borrow David Abrams' book title, that really drew you into nature. So I could personalize the question by saying, how much of that lingers in the work that you're doing now? How much of that is still there, that passion? So I hope that question makes sense. I'm trying to introduce it.
Can I just ask a question back? I mean, do you really think it's the role of a classically liberal democratic state to, I don't know what, influence people's internal life in that deep a way? My sense of classical liberalism is, right, we allow people their own notion of the good, and we defend the universal notion of the right. But it seems deeply important to me that it's not the role of the state to go that far down into the psyche of people.
But you see, the problem that I have is in the way that you phrase it. Classical liberalism believes that the psyche is internal. And that's a problem that I think we're facing now. The psyche is not internal, it's coextensive with nature. If Jung has taught us anything, he has taught us to believe that we are part of nature because in the depths of our psychological being, both at the instinctual level and the archetypal level, at the level of soul and spirit, we belong to nature. So it's not even that we're in nature, nature is in us. And if we don't pay attention to that, then I think we've had 100 years of depth psychology to teach us that what we don't pay attention to comes back to haunt us in a terrible way from the side of repression. I will grant you this much. How do we move from the lessons that we have learned about dealing with the unconscious shadow in individuals to groups, to nations, to cultures? It's almost an insurmountable issue. But I think it's an issue that is worth the challenge. I think it's tough, but I think we have to face them. I think we need to begin to develop a kind of ecological therapeutics.
I agree, but I just don't think it's the role of the state to do that.
Well, then who?
Maybe the community of analysts. I mean, it's like I'm sorry. If I had, I deeply appreciate being invited. And I'm having a great time. And I'm even worse than Hal. It hasn't been 10 years of Freudian therapy. It's been 10 years of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I'm really outside the pale. But saved my life. So there you go. But if we were organizing a philosophy conference, and you guys have done a great job in this, is you've got a bunch of philosophers here who all come at philosophy from a very different perspective. But it seems like we've got a bunch of analysts here who all are calling themselves Jungian. Now I wonder what's being left out, And the problem that I have in trying to answer questions like this is that you're starting from premises that you deeply believe are true in a language that you think makes sense. But to me, right, I'm not sure if that's the language or the set of concepts that I should feel I have to respond to, right? Because I haven't been, and I don't mean this in a bad way. I haven't been baptized in that religion.
But we have all been baptized in the waters of political liberalism, and the danger that we face there is that we begin to take that language for granted. I think when dialogue really works, and I'm going to try and speak to this tomorrow, it works because we are willing to have ourselves humiliated by the other person's perspective. And so while I agree with you about maybe it's not the job of the state, and maybe it's the job of the analyst to educate, there is nobody on the Council of Advisors to the President, for example, who bears the title the Council of Dream Worker, right? Or the Council of the Psyche, all right? The other problem, Andrew, that I want to address in what you just said, maybe it is up to us as analysts, but we are powerless. Philosophers, by and large, are powerless.
Oh, definitely.
Academics, by and large. And giving that hierarchy of powerlessness, probably the analysts are even below the philosophers and the academics.
No, you guys get paid more. And then,
But then it comes back to the economic issue, which is what I started with. So before we laugh ourselves out of the dilemma, what I would like to say is that since we speak out of a question of powerlessness, how do we get people in power to listen to us? And that's what I've been hearing for 2 days, that the dialogue has been taking place at 2 levels. I had an image, hard, soft, phallic receptivity, head, heart, the powerful and the powerless. How do we open up the space in politics so that the disadvantaged, powerless voice can have a say?
That's the Civic Renewal. A different.
But that's what I was trying to say, that a common ground is a sustainable, not only U.S., a sustainable future for the planet. This is a common ground, and we haven't created fully the language that says the common ground is what's going to sustain all of life.
Well, but it can't be just language. It has to be a real opportunity. It can't be the words of an opportunity, but a genuine opportunity. Because I would agree with what you said, that most people have been left out of the dialogue. And I think the voting polls show that. I mean, 20-30% voting for president, people have dropped out, and not, I think, accidentally. I mean, dropped out because they're not part of the process. They're not part of any decisions. And so I think that's a daunting challenge, and I don't know what the answer is personally, but it's a daunting challenge.
Well, it's a problem that I've been working on my whole life in terms of my own profession with respect to psychology. And I don't think that a common language.
I'm not saying common language. I'm saying common issues.
Or common issues.
Everyone cares about clean water, air,
grandchildren,
security of food, and their children, just as a minimal basis. And we have not constituted those grounds, those plural grounds, as saying that's what's going to sustain not only the U.S. but the whole life systems.
Yeah.
And I'm simply saying, I'm not. This isn't a critical comment. It's an invitation to all of us to say, how do we frame sustainability in a way that has political traction, and not just special interests? I'm not saying I have a way forward, but we in the U.S., apart from certain state and mayor initiatives, have not really made sustainability something that's palatable. And in fact, it's almost, not permissible in a lot of
Mary
ways.
Evelyn, just a challenge to your statement. What is clean water? Define clean water. I'm asking you as a scientist to define clean water.
Well, what's the point of your question?
The point is that you could probably end up with 20 definitions, at least, of what is clean water, depending on the levels of pollutants in that water.
But see, this is what we've gotten into. We've gotten into a managerial, legislative approach.
But that's exactly the problem, is that that's how people would look at that problem on a very pragmatic, practical level at a local, but my definition is so many parts per billion of this substance, not this substance. And immediately you have factions.
But I'm still saying that there has to be a way to move beyond every type of quantifiable dimension of nature.
That's right.
To say
That's right.
There's a ground on which life, not just human life, is going to be sustained.
But I think that's what Robert is saying, is
Yeah.
that the question I just asked you came from here. Okay. Where else could that question come from?
That's exactly. So what kind of common ground does not subject itself to calculative thinking?
Right.
And that's
because calculative thinking is precisely what has gotten us
exactly.
into this.
Yeah, one perspective or one angle on this might be from a Taoist approach that would see absence as some response, Robert. If I'm able to present a coherent set of thoughts to work this out. In that sense, there's a dream. What is clean water? The question implies a dream, which is an absence. It is not, in fact, a reality in that sense. The Tao being great recedes. Having recedes, it goes far away. Having gone far away, it disappears. Having disappeared, it returns. So the dream is the absence of a reality. And yet the dream is implemented by the paring away, it seems, of the jitter of the world. So again, the implementation comes by some kind of absence, that which is pared away. And I think eventually what Robert's question is, as I hear it, is bringing forward is some question about the character of the Tao in this issue of environmental a sustainable way forward. And that's an absence. It's a dream that we have. It's not here yet. And so we come to that absence by paring away. And one of the things we pare away is these considerations that are very real in the jitter of the world, so many parts per billion, but we pare it away in order to get at the dream, the Tao, the absence. So it's not as if a Taoist approach would say any one of them is incorrect, but they are, in a sense, pared away.
I would think, though, that because I'm interested in the notion of how absence is also haunted by presence. And so I think if you begin to pare away, I like that phrase, the jitters of the world, is I think what you said. And at some point, and again here I must confess I'm working out of my own paradigm, the Jungian archetypal paradigm, and I'm hearing some of the things that you said. What comes into that place, what begins to shimmer as a kind of possibility that unites us all, are the fact that we are mothers and fathers, are the fact that we die, are the fact that we want to be remembered. Things like this seem to me to hold a common ground, and I like your phrase, a common ground, not so much a common language. I don't know if particularly those things make an appeal, but I do think we have to find something that unites us all in this huge question about global climate change, where we can begin to speak to each other out of that common ground.
You know that as somebody who studies psychology in a different way, more empirically, classic academic, that I look back over the work I've focused a lot on risks over the years, and I'm trying to think back now and think about what's moved large bodies of people to do things. And the answer I come up with time and time again is fear. When I look at what has motivated great aggregates of people to engage, to radically change their behaviors. That's not what we want here, but I'm just trying to think very practically now about the world I see out there. And so how do you build something that is that motivating in the most general sense? Because I can just see this, you look at 9/11, you look at all of the terrorism work that's going on now. I look at every risk communication study I know. The best independent variable I can give you is fear and worry if you want to change behavior. So
I agree with the empirical results of that.
Right.
In the 80s, when I was working on my book on technology and nature, I had a dialogue with Hans Jonas, a philosopher from the New School, and James Blight, a Harvard psychologist, who at that time was working on a book called Fear and Learning in the Nuclear Crisis, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And while I agree with the empirical results, the problem with fear is that it keeps us in an us-then scenario.
It's a crappy variable. I mean, just a crappy motivator.
It's a motivator, but it's crappy, and we know what it did with the buildup of nuclear weapons. It led to mutual assured destruction.
I want to just quickly answer one thing to that, or add one variable which may break this us versus them up, and then I want to call on Don. The only time fear actually works as a motivator is if there is several other conditions there, and that is, first of all, an answer that looks like it will solve the problem, and if people actually feel that they can be part of it, or what they can contribute to it actually will make a difference. So fear alone as a motivator, actually, if nothing else is there and people don't have a sense of self-efficacy, they will always just lead to heads in the sand. So I want to just add that to the empirical side of it. And I also want to remind us that Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream not I had a nightmare. So I
or
want
I had
to.
a thought.
Well, or even a thought, right? But I mean, it's I think very important. You know, what do we draw up as the common ground?
Not just heads in the sand, it leads to scapegoating and bombing the shit out of people.
Oh, yeah, okay, done.
Well, stay with what you said for a moment. We've been talking about that in relation to the Gore film, that there's not some coherent and comprehensive and passionate sense of some reasonable hope or realistic hope. Is that the way it's gone? And yeah, we do need that. But I don't know how I kind of got sidetracked, but when you were talking about psyche, I think I took a different direction, and I was thinking that, well, maybe our psyches are an endangered species. And that I was actually relating to what you were saying now, that we are assaulted by powerlessness in the face of ignorance of power, present. We're threatened. It's difficult to feel, it's difficult to think when you're numbed by I would guess, some of the procedures that you were describing in Congress. It's kind of a Kafkaesque world where there is a way to get to see the prince or whatever, and I do need to do it, but I don't know which door, and it keeps changing, and I need to be there, and or the trial, I'm guilty, but I don't know of what. It's this bizarre kind of world that we live in, and then media is, at least what a lot of people see, is just, well, there's this, but then there's also that, and that's all we get. Or terrorism makes money. The CNN and the rest depend on, even though they're concerned about terrorism, they also depend on it for revenues. If you get a good story is one that lasts a long time. You don't have to go out making up, finding new stories. You got one that's there every day. We've got one with terrorism. Bush exploits it. So they're realistic things that I think we're assaulted by or challenged by, that threaten our ability to think and feel intelligently. And this is not projecting onto an other that's bad. It's I think just a recognition that we have to be intelligent about who we deal with and the institutions we deal with. So that's where I was going more with psyche rather than bringing it in. It's really, well, what are we under assault by?
Could you want to call him Dennis? I see it. Yeah.
I too have been very encouraged by many of the things I've heard here. This idea about again the patchwork, being able to force the corporations to do things differently, and yet I can't help but think, and that's why it's been so nice to be here to actually talk to Jeff directly, somebody who's an expert on climate change, that many of the experts in his field say 10 years before a tipping point. And to me, that adds a certain intensity to our thought and should prompt us to a certain boldness, I think, in our thinking. And Andrew, I think, very rightfully said, it's not the government's part. I mean, the government is set up to respond to the people. I think, given the internet and all that sort of stuff, there are things that are going to have to come from the grassroots. And Campbell thought that if there's going to be a new religion, it would be an environmentally based religion. So following along on that, it seems like rather than think of sustainability, it's like we have to think of ways of looking at the world that are very much, if we're thinking in a spiritual way, that indigenous peoples have looked at the world. They start off with what they were always dependent upon, what they call Mother Earth, the generic differences aside, but Mother Earth. And that's somehow another how I think we have to frame in whatever systems, liberalism or whatever, but the bottom line is there has to be some basic feeling and sense of life that is dependent on Mother Earth, and everything else comes above that. Sustainability, environmentalism as a particular issue. It's not a particular issue. It's like, no, this is like the Constitution. This is basic. And somehow or another, I feel that that's the challenge. I'm taking the challenge that way anyway. And I'm realizing in Andrew's challenge as well is that within the European community, I mean, this is some dialogue. I mean, we have our own jargon, yeah, and we probably have to focus something better within our own community. And I don't know how many addresses there were, for example, at the last international conference on global warming as a major issue. So I think we all have work to do within our respective communities. But again, 10 years is not much. This is unique on the planet. We've never been in a position where we have, by all scientific use of the greatest computers, expertise and everything, say, wow, 10 more years and we as humans will have produced irreparable change on this planet. Now, what does that prompt us to do in response?
The whole conversation makes me feel really wistful. It's so good and important and right, and I think that it's all possible. But let me just call attention once again to the elephant in the room, and that's the power of the corporation. We were finding hope in the fact that maybe we can, by some sort of machinations, turn corporations towards the good, but we're not grasping what I think is a central issue, is that what the hell is the corporation doing in the center of this discussion, and how can we find ways to shape the discussion so that we can make it clear that the power of the corporation over our presumed democracy is deeply damaging to the kind of common ground that Mary Evelyn so eloquently described.
Can I follow that a little bit? Don, I liked what you said. To me, I'm not a therapist, but if I were doing therapy, I would say you described a pretty dysfunctional system.
Yeah, I was trying to.
Yeah, well, but I think that gets to the real nature of part of what the discussion is here. I mean, how dysfunctional have we become? And what are the sort of points at which you can leverage a turnabout or whatever? I'm reminded of the comment by President Bush, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I think it's reflective of kind of what you were suggesting. One of the antidotes to not being mired in fear after 9/11 was the advice to go out shopping.
Yeah.
And it resonates on a number of levels. One is that, are we enjoying the freedom of which product to choose, or freedom to be part of a decision-making process? Or have we lost the one in favor of the other, or sort of one has become endangered in favor of the other, just like the psyche may be endangered?
Just one brief story. Before the last election, back in the April before, I think it was, Bush gave a press conference. It was one of his first in quite a while. And it was the one where the press challenged him about, have you made any, do you think you've made any mistakes? Do you think you've done anything wrong? Would you do anything differently? They just kept coming back to it. And he, from my point of view, I analyzed the talk sort of line by line. He dissociated throughout the 2/3 of the interview. Just dissociated. He was not in the room or in his body. And so he would say things that they're called, they're sort of treated as funny, but they're bizarre. It's hard watching people, die on TV or something like that. Just talking about the Iraq War, or it's really difficult to comfort people who have died. And he meant to say to comfort families of people but this was just throughout. He had no awareness of what he was saying. And then listening to the commentary afterwards, there were one or two people who said, this is a little strange. but by and large, people were saying, well, he did make some good points. What world are we in?
To be fair about my comment,
and
I believe Governor Taki joined him in that comment. To spread the...
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just a single stream of thought. It
No.
was shared
It was-
between at least two people.
Andrew, you
So,
just,
it feels like important to pay attention to just how dysfunctional, you know, some of the systems are that we're in, and not to just internalize it all as well. We project our stuff out there. I mean, it's really out there. That's crazy.
What are you saying? You're not paranoid if it's true?
No, if you're paranoid, it probably is true. But you've got you're a little overinvested in it. That's probably what's going on.
Okay,
The advice was not just go shopping in New York and see a Broadway show.
Okay.
What could be wrong with that?
And all the channels
Because
are open.
I
to
worship
get
at the
it
Church of Broadway. So, but just to kind of go back to what Robert and I were saying, and I think this point is really important. The time frame is short. You know, the time frame is very short. In fact, if people are interested, even on the best projections of what signing on to Kyoto tomorrow would get us, it's not like you get no problem. As you know, it's the sea level rising, but it's not only that. Lots of other problems given the time frame of the buildup of greenhouse gases. And so, to go back to the way Mary Evelyn put it, I thought was quite right. It's a search for common ground, which actually we do not have the luxury at the moment of getting people to change their internal lives radically in order to get the kind of movement required to solve these kinds of problems. We don't have that. It's a changing consciousness is a millennial project, right? With the exception of some really bad examples, like Hitler's Germany or something like that. So given how long that takes, then we have to sort of find that common ground. So Mitch and I talked about this the other day, and the question I asked Mitch about, what do you say to the evangelical minister who thinks the world was created 5,000 years ago, but still wants to pressure Bush to do something about climate change? And I think we agree, we talked about this, is that, to my mind, right, then my job is to help this person to argue to their community that this interpretation of what Christianity implies is the best interpretation of what Christianity implies, not to get them to abandon those views which are part of their very being, which is part of their makeup. And I might disagree with it completely, right? But they're winding up in what I think is the right place. Will we disagree down the road on other things? Probably so. But this is important right now. And so we have a penchant in the environmental community to really respect the metaphysical views of traditional peoples, right? Even if we don't agree with them at all. And we give them the benefit of the doubt and we take it seriously that they take it seriously. But there's a whole bunch of other people in the society which we do not grant the same respect to, And we've got to stop that in order to find that common ground and figure out how to create that
May I
consensus.
respond to that, because I think you're making impositions and assumptions about what I'm saying or to my position, which I can
didn't mean
accept.
to.
But which I can accept, not just my position, but the way you're sketching out the problem. It is true that time is running out. But what concerns me is that if we just put on the side because time is running out, the fact that as human beings who are concerned with global warming cannot raise this issue in a psychological way because there's no time. That seems to me...
No, I'm not saying that at all.
You're pouring new
saying
wine
that
into
at all.
old skins.
No.
Secondly, I don't agree that the psyche or psychological life is interior. I think that notion goes hand in hand with the rise of the nation state and materialism beginning in the 15th century, and gives us a sense of the ego as an interior isolated subject, which has kept us from a common ground.
Even
and third, let me just finish my
Sure,
point.
sorry.
Third, it's not about going to somebody and asking them to abandon their views, using your example of a fundamentalist in some sort of religious issue. What I'm arguing for is getting people something much more reasonable, getting people to see the perspective that they're in so that they can be open up to other possibilities. You don't have to abandon everything, but at least open up your ears to other possibilities. That to me requires much less of a change.
okay, you had your I see a couple more.
I feel compelled to say that I didn't hear Andrew state what I think you heard.
I didn't intend to.
On all three counts?
Certainly the first one.
Maybe the first, but what about the other two?
I think we're going to leave that hatchet until later.
Sidebar.
I said
We'll
nothing.
talk about that over a beer.
Okay, David.
Well, I'm deeply in agreement with what Andrew said and with what Bob said.
So we better invite him to
Yes.
the
I just hear two very different languages, but I just,
right. That's right.
I need to name another elephant in the room, which is, I guess, my elephant that I'm carrying at the moment, but I have a sense probably it's present for a good number of other folks, and it's a real relevance here, because I do agree, Andrew. No, I don't think we need to expect government, politics, and legislation to legislate consciousness change or to affect people at that deep level you're speaking of. But we have to recognize that politics and political developments are deeply moved and affected by psychological tensions and stresses. Right now, I came here profoundly, confused and carrying a lot of shame and horror that's been building in me the last several years, of course, with what's coming down in Iraq. Shame at being an American, not just for refusal to sign Kyoto when we're the worst, the worst offender by far, but our response now, which is to just play this old scapegoating game and start bombing the shit out of people. Well, now as a Jew, I'm also carrying a whole other kind of shame, because I'm very proud of my Jewish heritage. But what's coming down in Israel and in Lebanon right now, these are profoundly psychological, or whatever one wants to call them. I cannot separate what's happening there from my sense of the urgency of what's happening on the planet, of global climate change, the systemic stress that this planet is under as a result of our obliviousness as a species. I see symptoms of stress in the human species, and I cannot help but see these, always the most facile response to stress is to just look around and blame it on somebody, and then start trying to negate them, erase them. And it seems to me this is now playing out in a very large way, but I can't separate it then from the basic sources of the stress. Well, if it is so evident from just glancing at the newspaper that we've got 10 years or that the time is so brief, well, and for most of us here, we've been aware of this for a quarter century and much longer for many of us. It's a situation that is outrageous. And it's quite natural, alas, that we would be expressing this symptomatically in these ridiculous, puerile, stupid, ignorant ways. But that's the psychological dynamic of the moment, within the psyche, not of the human, but within the systemic psyche that we are in, that we're a part of, this earthly psyche. And that does affect and play out there. I can't see, seems to me Palestinians and Israelis actually, when I get right down to it, we don't have anything in common, really. I mean, there's no way out of this long trip. There is nothing in common except for the place where they live and the ground on which they live. And without some kind of collective falling in love outward with that place, or beginning to ask, what is this land or what is this earth asking of us, I don't think we have a hoot of a chance of healing our social ills and our, intra-species incestuous violence. So that's why I think these issues are part and parcel of one another.
Do you think, I mean, you spoke so powerfully, moving, do you think, though, that Palestinian women and Jewish women, they do have something in common more than the land? They have the fact that they bear children, and that they want their children to grow up. And I want to give you an example. When the war in Kosovo was going on, I felt the same way you did. I feel that way almost every day when I wake up. So a question for me has been the lingering one. How do we get past our despair every morning when we wake up? What keeps us going? So when I made this film about Kosovo, all I did was I showed images and I played a soundtrack. And I picked images from the newspaper. Images of a group of women, for example, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, burying a child. Okay? And it was like a modern Pieta. Another image of a grandmother in one section that was being bombed with her grandson in a wash basin, cleaning out his ears. In the midst of all of this horror and terror, still doing that kind of thing. When I showed this film at the place, at the conference where we showed it, what grabbed people were the images of commonality. Because everybody knows what it means to love, to want to be loved. And everybody knows what it means to be the child of someone, and the brother of someone, and the husband of someone. These are bonds that I think forge a common ground.
And I agree with you, and of course I think that there are many other commonalities. But for some reason, these commonalities have not been gripping us or moving us yet. Perhaps because Bob simply trying to suggest that in the motivation, in the causal factors behind what was coming down in Kosovo, what is coming down now in Iraq at our hands as a country, what is coming down in Lebanon and northern Israel. What's behind that is not purely human dynamics. That how can we see those as separate from the various words being said here about the time is really urgent. We have 10 years until the threshold is passed. We're probably going extinct as a species. How can we separate that? So it's both there, perhaps, as in the deep causal dynamic, and so perhaps it's also there in the very possibility of a solution to these intrahuman, to so much violence, is that we need to open the equation onto what exceeds just us and realize that there are other active agencies here and that are making demands upon us.
But that's precisely why I think, and I don't want to gild the lily, that's precisely Jung's notion of the archetype in his later years, that it is extra psychic, that we're not just the agents or authors or the only actors in this drama.
Sure.
And so when I was giving those examples, that's transgenerational.
Right.
Just
Some
one other
people
point.
want to get into this.
Yeah, I just made one. Senator George Mitchell, the former senator who I really admire, who brokered the Good Friday Accords between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland, he said something after that, in which he said these people will only stop fighting when they're tired of killing each other. That to me was a chilling notion.
Can I be a government person here? And I'm going to try to be really simple. I think the task is to move away from business as usual, and I don't know how we do that. I guess it's becoming a practical question, at least for me. And it's moving legislatures and congresses and mayors and government leaders
on this.
That sounded great.
There really are two conversations going on.
Just
Deeper Jungian archetypal. There's a great power and passion in it. I keep on coming back to unusual coalitions, and the bare ground action that one aspires to initiate in the face of urgency. And intergenerational is so important, yet there's no youth here. And I don't want to certainly call attention to any deficiency on the part of the organizers, because any conference I go to, there's never youth. But it's so important that we work with schools, we work with high schools, we work with kids to help them work with the teachers and the principals and the leadership to help them design their own spaces to live in, to have places where you grow food in the city or in the countryside. This is an unusual coalition. It's not political. It's just beyond politics. It's about how we live our lives every day right now. And there are so many places that we can do it. And I'm constantly trying to think about different populations that we can work with that aren't represented in some of our conversations. The voices of youth are crucial, and we rarely listen to them because we don't invite them to our table. We talk a lot about the voices of diversity, and of course we all understand that and all the challenges and difficulties inherent in that, but how about the voices of different age groups? And how do we begin to move that forward and listen to what they have to say on both in an interior and exterior way? So I just all I want to say is that I value all the conversations about the depth of the despair, but I honestly feel, and I do feel I reflect on that every day too, but I honestly feel that I have no other choice other than to work with as many different people as I can to bring them into the conversation and build coalitions. Because as the Death of Environmentalism article points out, we've been bereft of those coalitions because we haven't even known how to look for them. And part of it is because we do think we have the truth. But if we go out and ask people, what are you thinking about this? If we ask kids, what do you think about this? If they ask elders, what do you think about this? We ask working people, what do you think about this? And really listen to what they have to say. We really can find a common ground. So Carolyn Merchant said to me yesterday, Mitch, your problem is that you're suggesting a voluntaristic solution to this. And I want to say that I'm not. And I'm not at all. Okay. But it's very easy for us to retreat to a voluntaristic solution because that's what a consumer culture teaches us to do. That we identify with some sort of way of fulfilling our own desires. But I really want to be a voice for advocating the opposite here, and that is that this coalition building is where I take the urgency, and I'll end with that.
Okay, I'm gonna wait. Hold. Everyone, hold their phone. I'm gonna exert the power of the moderator. I have a list here of names that people have raised their hands 5 times, so I'm gonna go around here, and I have your names on it. So.
Mitchell, thank you. That's a perfect segue, because one of the things that has really occurred to me throughout this whole discussion is that this really is an echo of the longstanding debate between shallow environmentalism and deep environmentalism. And that shallow is about working in the political system and finding coalitions. And in fact, climate change is one of those great examples where it's possible to think outside the box. Let's stop talking about environment. I mean, the neocons are interested in this issue because they want us to get off Middle East oil. And they recognize what that means. Businesses want in on it because there's enormous amount of money to be made. The evangelical groups want in on it because it helps satisfy their own moral standpoints. I mean, so that's where I'm with you. I don't care what your rationale is. Let's just get moving. And so, on the shallow side, that's, I think, entirely appropriate. But this kind of work that you and David and others are talking about is just as critical. Just asking the really deep questions of what does it mean to be a human being? What is nature? And what is the proper relationship between us, or within us, or however you want to think about it. And that work is absolutely critical. And you've seen a whole host of heroes within the environmental movement, like Aldo Leopold. Here's a guy, yes, he was a bureaucrat and he did very tangible things, but he wrote a book. He didn't launch a crusade, unlike Dave Foreman or David Brower, who are much more evangelical. So there's lots of different ways that intellectuals can affect radical change. And that may be a longer term issue, and it has to be dealt with. The other thing I want to say, though, is that we are not powerless, partly because of that, but also because of students. Okay? And this is just an anecdote, but it's a good one, because there was a group of students who were concerned about climate change in the year 2000. They said, well, what can we do? We're just a bunch of students. We don't have any power. We don't have any access or anything like this. They came up with the bright idea of traveling with John McCain as he went stumping through New Hampshire. Okay? Remember that election a long time ago? Pre-George Bush? So what they decided to do was very simple. They decided everywhere he went to give a town hall meeting or a public talk, they would go, they would listen, they would stand up at the end, and they would just ask a simple question: what's your plan for climate change? Sit back down. And of course, the first time it was like, yeah, I don't know. And the second time it was like, I don't know. And the third time it was, I don't know. But by the end of that tour of New Hampshire, there was a moment when John McCain was asked a question about something else. And John McCain said, you know, I don't know anything about that issue, but I do know something about climate change. Okay? And John McCain is now one of the leaders in the Senate on this issue, potentially presidential material. So, I mean, it's just a small example, but, you know, it's possible for the powerless to have influence.
Right.
And he does recount that story, by the way.
Does he?
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah.
Am I up?
Yes, you're
I'm
on my
not
list
sure I
next.
remember what I was
You can pass too.
I think it was in response to this question about we're running out of time to affect consciousness, and following a bit on that. I totally disagree with that, and in fact, I think maybe you even demonstrated how fast consciousness can be changed when you went through the history of the environmental movement, and when you told us about, in this very short period of time, all of the laws that were enacted. And I would just propose that that's something that comes from the collective and comes from consciousness and comes even from partly from the collective unconscious as a force within community to make change like that happen quickly. And that is what consciousness can do. And obviously it's now also gone back in a different way. We have also seen a rapid change from that initial legislative time period of an unraveling of that. And consciousness is involved in that process just as much. So I do think that consciousness can make a change, can change quickly and cause an outer world change.
So can I say 2 sentences in response? Because I just want to clarify that.
Okay.
This is,
The view that I want to say as clearly as I can, my view is that consciousness change cannot be a necessary condition for coming up with a solution to these problems. The environmental movement has often thought that that was the case. That was the original intuition of Arne Naess with deep ecology, right? And the shallow ecology, you know, the term shallow ecology is not supposed to sound like a good thing,
That's
right?
right.
So it can't be a necessary condition because of the time frame that we're working under. And I see we'll just use the term shallow and the deep strategies as completely compatible, right? And totally both important. And we've all got to mutually support each other in, you know, working on whatever end of that continuum that we're best talented, that we have the most talents in working on. I'm all about coalition building now. That's what I do, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I come up with this view that I'm not trying to change people's beliefs and attitudes. In fact, I think the only way we're going to get real solutions is, in fact, we come up with solutions that don't rely on changing people's beliefs and attitudes, that we build places, this is in Mitch's talk, in such a way that people can only help but live sustainably. That's the way the structure is built. So I completely agree with you. I just don't think it can't be a necessary condition for getting the change. If it is, then I start getting despondent.
Right. And I just want to follow up with